Thank you, Rotarians and guests. Thank you for your silence, and I was quite taken by your encouraging response when it was announced that I was going to say a few words early in the meeting. Thank you, Colin. Nice shout. Folks, Gerald Barker and myself have been asked to speak to the club today, and it's about a company which is a company and a project that is both he and I are very passionate about. We've put some brochures on the tables, and they cover to some extent the technicalities of this subject that we're speaking about. We thought that it would be a good idea to not get into the depths of the technicalities while we're speaking to you, because we didn't want to see you Rotarians nodding off. So we've titled our talk Coal, Oil, Gas and Algae, and it's a bit weird I suppose, but we'll get to explain what we're on about. There is a relationship. So it's about a company called Muradel, and Muradel is named after the Murdoch University over in Perth and the Adelaide University here in sunny South Australia, and together those two universities are the brains behind what we're actually doing. We are endeavouring to grow algae and transform that algae into what we are terming green crude oil. I'm the chair of that company and chairman today, and Gerald is our operations manager, and it'll be Gerald who'll be talking, making most of today's presentation. He's going to tell you more about Muradel, its antecedents, where it's been, where we're going and where we're at the present time. But before he does, I want to just make a couple of points about energy in general in Australia, including current consumptions, and to try to sort of put things into perspective. I'm going to speak briefly about coal and oil and gas, their strengths and weaknesses as I see them. Then I'll touch on some of the characteristics of algae and why, of all the potential organic feedstocks for biofuel production, algae stands out. Finally, I'd like to spend a minute or two suggesting where green crude might fit into the future of Australia. And by the way, we're talking about what might happen in Australia, but the conditions that we enjoy here are enjoyed in many other parts of the world as well. So what we're doing, we think there might be scope for it in other parts of the world. So about coal, oil and gas, let's get started there. The fossil fuels upon which we are currently so dependent. And this is approximately a grade 6 chemistry lesson, but they all contain carbon and hydrogen, and hence when they're burnt they all produce carbon dioxide and water vapour. Coal contains a hell of a lot of carbon and therefore produces much CO2, carbon dioxide. Gas contains much less carbon and much more hydrogen, and therefore it produces much less CO2 per unit of energy input. Oil is somewhere in between. Coal is solid and easy to handle, shovels, cranes, etc. Cavemen no doubt kicked it around. Oil is less so, but okay in buckets and tanks, and therefore ideal for transport. Gas, on the other hand, is invisible and difficult to capture and contain until relatively recently, and to store meaningful quantities then it must be compressed or liquefied. Using coal to produce steam and thence electricity is quite energy inefficient, and I think that everybody acknowledges the fact that for every 100 units of energy contained in the coal in the first place, about 30 units of it make it to the transmission system and the electricity distribution networks, where maybe a further 15% of that 30% is lost. So, I think we might have a slide on the thing by now saying, it just gives you a graph showing you how much coal, by the way, we export as opposed to how much we use. I think we're exporting something like 4 or 5 times as much as we're using ourselves at the present time. In terms of gas, using gas to generate electricity is, in a modern combined cycle power plant, lifts thermal efficiencies to around 65% and higher if you can actually incorporate a process called cogeneration as well. Oil is somewhere between again. But these days, for reasons of cost, its use for electricity generation is restricted to very remote areas here in Australia. At the moment, by the way, I don't know if the slides have caught up, but we've talked about how much gas we're using, but also it's worthy of note that pretty soon, by about 2016 or 17, we'll be exporting about 3 times as much gas as we use. At the moment, we use about as much as we export, but in another 3 or 4 years' time, we'll be exporting about 3 or 4 times as much as we use ourselves. Just a comment. Now, coal has had its day as a transport fuel after steam engines, as we all know. Oil-based liquid fuels have been the staple transport fuel for over a century, but for reasons of reserves, or reserves conjecture I should say, price and urban pollution reductions, a significant swing to gas as a transport fuel over the next couple of decades is predicted. Mankind, comment to me, I've been in the energy industry since 1956, and I've always worried about that since mankind gets cleverer exponentially, it's a pity we just can't shut down on all of our coal usage right now and bring it back later when we are much cleverer and we actually use it much more efficiently than what we do at the present time. All fossil fuels suffer from an underlying problem or two. The reserves are finite. The reserves are enormous, but their true extent is actually unknown. And those with the best idea of what the reserves are tend to keep it to themselves. By the way, I don't know whether he's with us today, but Graham Bethune is a member of this club as I would say, the expert on coal and gas and oil reserves in this country. Now, moving on to algae. Why algae? Well, algae needs to absorb CO2 to grow. It's a plant like all the others, like trees and the like. So it requires CO2 to grow as well as sunshine and water and nutrients. There's an enormous range of algae. It's not just the blue-green stuff that appears in the torrents every now and again. There's tens and hundreds of thousands. Gerald will get into that a little bit later to tell you about that. But it's naturally occurring, and some species grow in fresh water and some grow in brackish, and some of them grow in quite salty water, seawater, and some in salinity far higher, up to 4 times the salinity of seawater. Some strains can grow very, very quickly, doubling in a day or a day and a half, which is a hell of a lot quicker than some of the other plants that people look at for producing fuels. Some contain more oil than others, and algae can be farmed on the land, and it can be farmed on land as completely useless for anything else. Algae has been grown for production of health and beauty products for many years, and it's not new to see algae plants out there. It's just that trying to get them to the stage of efficiency where they're unviable for fuels is the challenge. Now, Murdoch University, they're biological people. They are the people who isolated a strain from over Western Australia in the sea, which grows rapidly and reliably, contains a hell of a lot of oil, thrives in seawater and way beyond. Adelaide Uni, on the other hand, undertook the challenge of engineering design, and they were responsible for the construction of a pilot plant up in Karratha in Western Australia, and they're in the process of doing the same thing here with Muradel for a larger scale plant up in Moyalla. Now, would it not be a huge step forward if, in the course of a few days, mankind could do what it actually took nature hundreds of millions of years to do? And that is exactly what happened, making oil and gas out of algae. Would it not be a huge step forward to absorb all or even more CO2 in producing the oil than is released when the oil is subsequently used? A huge reduction in the human contribution to CO2 build-up in the atmosphere is available. Would it not be a boost to regional and remote areas to build huge farms on otherwise useless land and create hundreds of jobs in the process, what's termed in America urban renewal, rural renewal? So it seems really to me, it seems there's nothing to lose, nothing to gain by growing our oil in the future. Now, as opposed to using trees and shrubs and seeds and corn and grasses and sugarcane, etc., as feedstock, algae requires a fraction of the land and Our strains need no fresh water at all, grows infinitely faster, uses useless land rather than valuable arable land. It's got a fair bit going for a heavier degree. Now just to put a little bit of, to conclude my bit, to talk about some observations about dimensions. In Australia we consume 1 million barrels of oil per day, out of about 90 million consumed globally. That equates to 160 million litres per day and 60 billion litres per annum here in Australia. We think we can produce about 50,000 litres per hectare per annum of green crude, which would require the use of something like 12,000 square metres of land. And if you get it right and allow a little bit for machinery and the like, that amounts to a block of about 120 kilometres by 120 kilometres, or bits and pieces that make that up. So that's about 0.2% of Australia's area. That's about 5 times the area of the ACT. And I think, apropos recent happenings, it would be a whole lot more productive. So anyway, the long-term vision is to use about 0.2% of our land, useless land at that, to produce 100% of crude oil requirements for this country sustainably, absorbing as much or more CO2 than released during its subsequent combustion, using only algae, sunshine and salty water. The challenge of course remains to do it commercially, at a product price comparable with the, and I've got to say, ever-changing price of conventional crude oil. So with those few words, the bloke who knows a lot more about it than me, Gerald Barker. Thanks, Gerald.
Thank you, Chairman. He's my Chairman, by the way, as well as Rotary Chairman. Greetings. My quick talk through is going to introduce our team, because really it's not just Ollie and me, we've got a whole team behind us. I'm going to talk a little bit about a company actually started 13 years ago, the first Australian algae company to be created. I'm going to talk a little bit about microalgae. I'm then going to get into a little bit of detail, the how, the why, the when and the wheres. I'm going to give you a little bit of an insight to a recent showcase we put on to kind of get a little bit of publicity for Muradel, and I'm going to talk a bit about the future, because we're not just there doing academic research, we really are aiming to get this thing over the line to being commercial. So this is the team of our Muradel operation. Of particular note is bottom right, David Lewis, who's probably still in the air coming from Dallas back to Australia. He's been attending one of the biggest algae conferences held every year in the world called the Algae Biofuels Organisation, and David's been presenting on behalf of Muradel there. There's a whole team of young people doing postgraduate, PhD work at the University of Adelaide, and we've got a team of young people, people with biology skills, engineering skills, and project management. So, as I say, it's all about a whole team of people. SQC was started by a dear old guy called John Baxter, who is well known to Ralph Arthur. I think they share the age of about 93. John realised back in the late 90s that the world may well run out of fossil fuels, and his insight was way ahead of everybody else. He'd followed a project in the 70s with the Department of Defence, who researched an algae that was available and growing in the lakes up in the Northern Territory. Dr. Lance Hillen and Lindsay Wake, who of course invented the black box. SQC set up a laboratory at Port Lincoln and did a lot of work on this algae, which is absolutely superb in every respect. There's only one problem. It doesn't grow fast enough, but it actually oozes hydrocarbon oil. And it's certainly true that a lot of our fossil fuel came from this algae billions of years ago. But we've had to put this one to the side. It does want just fresh water, and there's not as much fresh water around Australia as there's salty water. You know, algae are an amazing creature. There's some 40,000 of these. They're actually a plant, I should correct myself there. They are actually responsible for producing 60 to maybe 70% of the world's oxygen, not trees and grass, as a lot of people think. There's also another range of algae which you'd know as seaweed, and there's probably 13,000 different varieties of them around the world as well. So algae are actually vital to life. They provide the nutrition in the oceans. Algae and plankton are pretty much related to one another. But it's a whole topic in its own right. But some of them under the microscope really do look quite fascinating. Well, Algae is commercial, and in fact in Australia they've got one of the largest algae farms in the world at Hutt Lagoon, north of Perth, and there's one even at Whyalla, and they produce a product called beta-carotene, which is used for a whole range of products. And I'd love to talk more about that. So let's get down to the sort of the nitty-gritty, and perhaps just first up, the question of why is a bit of an issue. Why not just carry on using fossil oil? We're going to have all these reserves. But the oil price in real dollar terms has been increasing in the last few years. Those that remember the oil spike back in the 70s, well, in real dollar terms, that was pretty significant. We're not sure where the oil price is going to go, but it's certainly not going to go down. Because really, the problem is the world's still increasing its demand for fossil fuels, and in particular liquid fuels. Not so much in the developed world, but the OECD, or the non-OECD, and in particular countries like China, they're just going mad with it. And it's certainly true that the United States has got an insatiable appetite for oil, and they're spending a lot of money on algae research. It's interesting to say, well, how much do we all use every day of the week, or for every man, woman and child? And Australia's not the highest, but we're fairly high up on the list. Those other countries are reasonably recognisable in that they've got a lot of cold conditions, and no doubt they chew up a lot of energy and electricity. So we are actually a major oil consumer, 1.3% of the world, but only a fraction of the world's population. So we really do have to do something about it. Well, let's have a look at the what, and here we have our step-in algae technician examining algae under the microscope. And if we want to take a closer look, this is what our algae looks like. It's called Tetraselmis, you don't have to remember that, and it's only really the size of the diameter of a human hair. So if you looked at a Gerald, you wouldn't even see the individual algae cells, but they do grow very fast. And they've actually got little sort of legs on the back, and that helps them move around in the water column so they can get enough sunshine. The project that we are now involved with started back in 2007, involving 2 universities, and they had little small-scale ponds no bigger than a square metre or 2 square metres, both at, in Perth and University of Adelaide, and that led to an expansion program where a pilot plant was built in the Pilbara near Karratha, and the aerial view there shows 3 ponds which are 200 square metres in size. We've got smaller ones that are used to inoculate up the algae. And we've just completed running that and done all the trials and got all the basic productivity data and done some initial trials on being able to harvest the algae. Now, I've got a video that somebody was going to help me play, and so we'll flick to that in a second. This is a photograph of our pilot plant at Karratha. We essentially use raceway ponds, which are a much lower cost than any other configuration for algae. And there's a thing called a paddle wheel, and it really just rotates and mixes the algae as the operation carries on. Are you ready for this one? There's the next. Technical difficulties meant we didn't get it stitched in, but here we are. Keep telling people that noise is the flies, because in the summertime it's pretty darn dreadful, and it's about 44 Celsius. Karratha was chosen because of its high sunshine hours. The only problem is that it's a very expensive place to do technical work, and it tends to get cyclones that roll through. So this just shows you the view of our plant, and it's reasonably simple to design, rubber-lined ponds. You can see it sweeping around, and away in the distance is a major power station that Rio Tinto operate. They actually lent us the land. We'll cut from that, if that's possible. That's it. Now, Australia is a vast continent with a very small population, and even the Americans are saying Australia would be an ideal place to grow algae. We've got the right temperatures, we've got large areas of low rainfall, except sort of around the north and the east, and we've got high solar radiation. So it is really regarded internationally as an ideal place. It's politically stable, and we've got the right infrastructure. Now look, this is an engineer's process diagram, but it very briefly shows you how we actually produce oil from algae. First of all, we have the algae ponds, and we put in some nutrients. We bring in make-up water to combat evaporation, and we recycle as much as we can. We then take the algae out every day and we concentrate it from about 0.05% to 25%, and I'll show you briefly what that looks like. Having harvested the algae, we convert it into bio-crude, and that can be either used directly or as a feedstock to an oil refinery. So yes, the harvesting from the ponds goes through a special technology that the University of Adelaide developed called electroflocculation. We put it through a centrifuge and it really actually comes out like toothpaste, and it's then that we convert it into oil. And this conglomerate of pipes and vessels and so on is what we have found works extremely successfully. It's really just a pressure cooking operation, and we use about 100 times the pressure you put on your car tyres, so it's pretty significant. And we use about 340 Celsius, and that literally converts all of the algae, produces a little bit of CO2 which we send back to the ponds. So stitching it all together, our operation basically involves algae production, which we really say is a farming operation. We have the harvesting, we produce a nice concentrate, and we convert it into oil. And we've done some trials on that oil in overseas with one of our partners, and lo and behold, it produces a whole range of products which, if you distill, could end up with a multiple of markets. Our focus is on fuel, but some of these other products may find other end users. So right now we're into stage 3, which is scale up, and of course this is a chemist's idea of scale up, and it's actually why they've needed to bring in the chemical engineers, because this is not how a chemical engineer would do it. But we are certainly scaling up times 20 from 200 square metre ponds to a 4,000 square metre pond. We've been able to find a site just at the edge of Whyalla, and with fantastic support from the Whyalla Council, we've got a 2-hectare site which used to look like that, and I'll show you in a minute what it looks like today. Our basic demonstration plant, as we're calling it, has this large 4,000 square metre pond which will probably mimic what we'll use in full scale. It's got some salt water storage, it's got laboratories, it's got the harvesting system, and it's got the algae conversion technology. And so that was the design that we put together earlier this year. And yes, this is the activities on site to level what was essentially just a bare area with a bit of trees and shrubs. And today, or literally on Saturday, these are the shots that were sent through from our team at Whyalla. So our timetable is to now build the plant. It's to run a 12-month trial, because we've got to understand how the algae grows for every month of the year, summer to winter. We're going to be doing a detailed amount of assessment. We'll be looking at the carbon footprint, and most importantly, we'll be assessing the economics. We've got a model now that says this looks viable, but until we run the demonstration plant, we won't have all the numbers. But we do need to get to the stage of saying, well, if the economics are there, then we're going to talk about some substantial scale up. In June, we conducted a publicity program. The then Minister of Energy came across and met with Ollie and our team at Whyalla, and then he came on to Adelaide, and we had an event at the Science Exchange in Adelaide, and if all works well...
This bottle of green crude signifies a big achievement by Muradel that has the potential to usher a whole new industry in Australia. The Australian-based renewable fuels company has already been converting algae to crude as a part of a $10.7 million project. In the next phase of this project, Muradel will be scaling up in Whyalla.
I think it's an exciting project for Whyalla and for the state and for the country and, you know, dare I say, for the world.
Biofuels made from algae alone have the potential to displace about 30 billion litres of fuel each year. If commercialised, the company's green crude may be used as a sustainable alternative.
It's a project that's about our search for a sustainable way of manufacturing fuels for transport, fuels for aviation, fuels to drive trucks.
The whole idea of this is to prove trying to make a green crude at something like the same price as the traditional crude, and if we're able to do that, and we're quite confident at this stage that we will be able to, then the next stage we're talking about is maybe 100 acres or something like that.
Hundreds of job opportunities are expected during construction, plus more if it moves on to the next phase.
What?
I've cut there what I'd like to do is just summarise where we are. It's certainly true that we've got a small beginning. We've got a 2 hectare site, but we've got all the elements that are ultimately going to make up a commercial application. We're going to be using local contractors, local staff at Whyalla, and it's certainly true that they've been very supportive up there. Longer term, and there's a big if, this wouldn't be R&D unless we had to say there's still some answers to be gained, but the really important thing is that the next step beyond that is a commercial sized operation, and we're talking many hundreds of hectares and many millions of dollars. So it's certainly true that that is the step beyond our project, which, just to put a number on it, we're going to be spending about $10 million on this exercise. The money spent prior to that was around about $6 to $8 million. So it's not an insignificant investment, and we're certainly very mindful of the money that we've had coming into it. So while the photo on the left is an artist's impression, the one on the right is actually a plant in southern United States of America. It's not fully operating yet, but there's a lot of people around the world that are pushing to get this thing to be commercial. So it really is an interesting story of discovery, finding the algae strain, the Murdoch people, doing the engineering, and it's been vital to combine the two disciplines, and finally to find an end use for this and a real possibility that we can actually produce sustainable, renewable fuels. So look, I'm going to leave it there and perhaps invite Ollie to come up for a last few words.
Thanks very much, Gerald. Now, folks, we've run out of time, so we haven't got much to say. We'll answer questions down at the table here. I want to get Gerald back to work fairly quickly, though. I would say that there's a couple of parties that we like to acknowledge here, because we've been the recipients of fairly generous funding from the Commonwealth Government, without whom we wouldn't have got very far. And I've got a big backer from India and ABAN Australia, who've put a lot of money in. So we want to do that. So finally, I'd just like to thank Gerald for getting through it so quickly, Gerald. I took 2 minutes of your time, I'm sorry about that. And I think at this point, Frank, it's time I'll hand back to you. Thank you.